Hello everyone, I want you to imagine something. You are standing at the edge of a cliff and someone you are negotiating with is standing on the other side. Between you is a narrow bridge, fragile, cracked, barely holding for weeks. You have been telling them to walk across to meet you halfway to end the standoff. You threaten them, you pressure them, you promise consequences, and then right when they hesitate, right when they consider stepping forward, you take a hammer and you start breaking the bridge yourself. That is what Donald Trump just did again. And if you think this sounds irrational, wait until you see how deliberate it actually is, because what happened after the blockade announcement was not chaos, it was structure, it was sequence, and it was predictable. Now I want to show you something deeper, because everyone is focused on the surface oil prices, ships, military threats, but nobody is asking the real question: what was the objective? Not the stated objective, not the public narrative, the real objective. Because once you understand that everything starts to make sense, let me begin with something simple. The timing of this blockade is not random. It came immediately after failure. Not just any failure, a very specific kind of visible, public, undeniable failure. The kind that damages perception, and perception in geopolitics is everything. Because power is not just force, is belief, the belief that you can win, the belief that you are in control. And when that belief cracks, leaders react not strategically, but psychologically. And this is where everything changes, because this blockade is not about Iran, it is not about oil, it is about restoring an image, the image of control. But here is the problem: when you try to restore control through escalation after losing it, diplomatically, you don't regain power, you expose weakness, and that is exactly what is happening now. Let me take you one layer deeper, because there is a pattern here, a pattern that repeats: first, create pressure; second, escalate demands; third, reject compromise; fourth, force confrontation; and finally, blame the other side. You have seen this pattern before, not just here, but across multiple conflicts, and every time it leads to the same place, deadlock. But this time, the consequences are different, because this time the system itself is shifting. And this is where most people are not paying attention. While everyone is watching the blockade, something else is happening quietly. China and India are adjusting their trade routes. BRICS nations are shifting to yuan and rupee-based energy settlements. Gulf states are recalculating their alignments, and these changes do not reverse easily, because once trust is broken, once systems adapt, they don't go back, they move forward in a new direction, and that direction may not include you. Now think about this. If a country sees that access to global trade can be restricted overnight, what does it do? Does it comply, or does it adapt? Does it depend, or does it diversify? This is the unintended consequence. Every blockade teaches the world how to survive without you. And once they learn, they don't forget. Now here is where it becomes dangerous, because the immediate effects are visible. Oil prices rise, markets react, politicians respond, but the long-term effects, they are silent. They happen slowly, until one day you realize the system you built no longer revolves around you. And by then it is too late. Now the reaction that matters most is not from enemies, not from allies, but from neutral countries like Turkey, Indonesia, Brazil. They are watching carefully, quietly, and making decisions about alignment, about risk, about future positioning. And every action like this pushes them slightly away, not dramatically, not immediately, but steadily. And geopolitics is not about sudden collapse. It is about gradual shifts until the balance changes. And when it does, it looks sudden, but it was building for years. Now let me take you to the economic layer, because this is where the real impact is. Energy is not just a commodity, it is the foundation of modern civilization, transport, manufacturing, food production. Everything depends on it. And when you disrupt energy flow, you don't just create scarcity, you create instability, global instability. And instability does not stay contained. It spreads through markets, through economies, through societies, eventually through politics. And this is where leaders lose control, because economic pressure turns into political pressure, and political pressure forces decisions that may not align with strategy, but with survival. And this is the trap, because once you enter this cycle, every move becomes reactive, not proactive. And reactive leadership is unpredictable, and unpredictability is the most dangerous factor in any global system. Now here's the part that should concern you the most. What happens when the blockade is challenged, not by rhetoric, but by action? What happens when a ship decides to test the line, not hypothetically, but physically? What happens when that moment arrives? Because it will, and when it does, there are only three options: enforce, ignore, or escalate. Each one has consequences, and none of them are simple. But here is the real question: which one will be chosen? And more importantly, who will make that decision? Because in moments like this, decisions are not always rational, they are emotional, and emotional decisions in high-stakes environments change history sometimes permanently. And this is where we move to the next layer, because what you are seeing right now is not the peak, it is the beginning, the setup for something larger, something that has not yet unfolded. And when it does, it will redefine everything you think you understand about power, about control, and about who is actually winning and who is not. But there is one more piece, one piece that connects everything. Who benefits really? Because the answer is not who you think the primary beneficiary, because the answer is not who you think the primary beneficiary, because of a fragmented energy market are China through yuan-based oil contracts, Russia through redirected pipelines, and Gulf states hedging between both blocs. Every escalation accelerates their relevance. And when you find that out, you understand why this is happening and why it may not stop anytime soon. Now continue with me, because what we just uncovered was only the surface layer. So let us follow the pattern, because the next phase is already unfolding quietly. While most people are still debating whether the blockade will work or fail, the real shift is happening somewhere else. It is happening in behavior, specifically how other countries are reacting, not what they are saying, but what they are doing, because statements are cheap, actions are expensive, and expensive actions reveal truth. Now, look carefully. Shipping routes are not stopping. They are adjusting. Insurance premiums are not collapsing. They are recalculating. Energy buyers are not panicking. They are diversifying. This is not the behavior of a world that believes in enforcement. This is the behavior of a world that is preparing for circumvention. And that distinction is everything, because enforcement requires compliance. But circumvention destroys control slowly, silently, irreversibly, because circumvention does not happen overnight. It happens step by step. First alternative routes, then alternative currencies, yuan, rupee, dirham, then alternative agreements, bilateral energy deals, outside dollar systems, and finally alternative systems like the BRICS payment infrastructure being built right now. And once that final step is reached, the original system does not collapse dramatically. It becomes irrelevant, and irrelevance is far more dangerous than defeat, because defeat can be recovered from irrelevance. Cannot now think about this carefully. If major economies like China and India start conducting energy trade outside traditional dollar channels, what happens to pricing power? What happens to financial leverage? What happens to sanctions? They weaken not immediately, but progressively. And once weakened, they lose their effectiveness. And when that happens, tools that once shaped global behavior become symbolic. Not functional trust is the invisible foundation of every global system, and trust is built over decades, but it can be damaged in moments. And when trust weakens, countries hedge, they don't announce it. They simply adjust quietly, strategically, and those adjustments accumulate until one day the balance has shifted. Now, let me bring you to a very specific scenario. A tanker approaching the contested waters. It carries energy, critical supply. Its destination is China or India. Its flag belongs to a country that does not want confrontation, but also does not want disruption. Now, the moment arrives, does it stop or does it proceed? And that decision is not just about one ship, it is about precedent. If it passes without resistance, the message is clear, the line is negotiable. If it is stopped, the risk is real. But stopping it comes with consequences. Allowing it also comes with consequences. Every option weakens something: authority, credibility, or stability, and there is no perfect choice, only trade-offs. Now, once a line is tested and a response is triggered, it moves from theory to reality, from statements to actions, and actions create reactions, especially when multiple actors are involved. The US Navy, Iranian forces, Chinese energy buyers, and neutral flag carriers. Each one has its own interests, its own calculations, its own red lines. And when these collide, complexity increases rapidly, and complexity collide is where mistakes happen, miscalculations, misinterpretations, overreactions. Now, there is another layer here, domestic pressure, because while all of this is happening externally, internally, pressure is building in Washington, politically in Tehran, economically, and among third-party nations strategically, and these pressures do not operate independently. They interact, they amplify each other, and eventually they force decisions that may not align with long-term strategy, but with short-term survival. Now, here is a turning point. This situation can move in two completely different directions. One path leads to de-escalation, gradual, controlled, managed. The other path leads to confrontation, sudden, uncontrolled, and potentially irreversible. And the difference between these two paths often comes down to one moment, one decision, one reaction, because the system is already under stress. Economic stress, strategic stress, psychological stress, and stress systems are unstable. They can hold for a while, but not indefinitely. And when they reach a breaking point, they don't fail gradually, they shift quickly. What happens when multiple countries, China, India, Turkey, decide not to challenge the blockade directly, but to ignore it collectively? What happens when enforcement becomes selective, inconsistent, uncertain? What happens when the perception of control starts to fade? Not through defeat, but through doubt, because doubt is the beginning of the end for any system built on authority, and once doubt spreads, it is very difficult to contain, and that is exactly what is happening right now beneath the surface. That means you are paying attention. So let us go deeper, because everything we discussed so far still exists within a visible framework: ships, routes, decisions, pressure, but the real transformation is happening beneath that framework in the invisible architecture, the structure that holds everything together. Global systems are not controlled by single actions. They are shaped by repeated behavior patterns that build over time, and once those patterns are established, they become expectations, and expectations become reality. This is how influence works, not through force alone, but through predictability, the belief that outcomes can be anticipated, that rules will be followed, that lines will hold. But what happens when predictability disappears? When rules become flexible, when lines become negotiable, you don't just lose control, you lose trust, and trust, once weakened, changes behavior everywhere. Now imagine the scenario: shipping companies in Singapore, Greece, and Norway reviewing the same information. They see the risks, they see the uncertainty, and each one must decide, continue as usual or adjust, and they don't wait for clarity. They act based on probability, risk assessment, cost calculation, and once enough of them make similar adjustments, a pattern forms, routes change, pricing models shift, contracts get rewritten, and suddenly the system looks different, not because of one decision, but because of many small ones moving in the same direction. This is how transformation happens, quietly, gradually, and then all at once. Now, the psychological layer, perception of power. Power is not just capability, it is perception, the belief that capability will be used effectively, consistently, decisively, and when that perception weakens, power itself weakens, even if military capability remains unchanged. This is why credibility matters. This is why consistency matters. Now think about the signaling. Every move sends a signal, not just to adversaries, but to the entire system. If signals are clear, responses are aligned. If signals are mixed, responses diverge, and divergence creates fragmentation. Right now, different actors are interpreting the same signals differently. China sees opportunity, Europe sees uncertainty, Gulf states see leverage, and when interpretations split, coordination breaks down, and this is where control becomes difficult, because control requires alignment, and alignment requires clarity. Now bring this back to the blockade on the surface. It is a physical action, but beneath that it is a signal, and the question is, what message is being received? Is it a message of control or a message of reaction? Because those are not the same. One reinforces authority, the other invites challenge and quiet defiance. Is far more difficult to counter than direct opposition, because it spreads like a ripple, and by the time it is visible, it is already widespread, because we are not dealing with a single actor, we are dealing with a network. The US, Iran, China, India, Russia, Gulf states, and dozens of neutral players. Each one is adjusting based on its own priorities, and when all of these motivations interact, the outcome becomes non-linear, meaning small inputs can create large outputs unexpectedly. Now consider the economic feedback loop. Every disruption creates secondary effects: higher costs, reduced supply, market volatility, and these effects feed back into the system, amplifying the original disruption, and this loop can accelerate quickly in a tightly connected global economy, and that moment is approaching faster than most people realize, because the system is already under pressure, and pressure does not remain static. It builds, it accumulates, and eventually it forces release. And when that release happens, the consequences extend far beyond the original trigger. Now here is the question that defines everything that comes next. When that moment arrives, who is prepared? Not who is powerful, not who is loud, but who is prepared. Because preparation is what determines outcomes in complex systems. Not intention, not rhetoric, not even capability alone, but readiness, adaptability, and timing. China has been preparing alternative systems for a decade. Russia rerouted its energy exports within months of 2022 sanctions. Gulf states are simultaneously selling to Washington and Beijing. And who is reacting? That is where this is heading and why the final outcome may be very different from what most people expect. And that is where everything changes.